Let's play a game. Imagine a world where China and America are at war, but America loses, and China becomes the world's uncontested superpower. And as punishment, China breaks up the United States. California becomes its own country, Florida and Texas become their own countries, and even New York, home of the most American city ever, is taken away, stripped from America, and becomes its own country. America as you know it is no more, and as an American, that would break your heart. But let's take it a step further. Not only have the most American states become not American anymore, but China comes in and installs pro-Chinese, pro-communist governments in California, New York, and Florida, maybe even Canada and Mexico as well. One could even call these new heads of state puppet governments that only answer to Beijing. But it doesn't stop there. Suddenly, China gets California to join a military alliance with China, putting the Chinese military and Chinese nukes at the front door of America. Now, if any conflict occurs between America and California, maybe a border dispute, an accidental shootdown of an aircraft, etc., the full force of China will rain down upon America in an instant. Now, I bet that will make you feel a little uneasy and a little uncomfortable, but let's keep going. Then just a few years later, China maybe gets Canada to join that military alliance too, then Florida a few years after that. And then finally, they're welcoming New York into the alliance with open arms. This is the final straw. China has already taken so much away from America, and now they have to come after New York too? The crown jewel of what was once America? The essence of America where all our culture and movies are centered around? That's just a few hours away from Washington, D.C. Sure, New Yorkers have a slightly different accent than Americans, but we're practically the same. New York falling to the Chinese would be the red line. In this hypothetical, America invading New York right now would actually be less risky than waiting for them to join China's military alliance. We could liberate the New Yorkers now and welcome them back into the States without the full force of the Chinese military. But if we wait for them to join China's military alliance, all would be lost. Ukraine is to Russia what New York is to America. America created Vladimir Putin, and Ukraine is our fault. But to understand why, we have to take a trip back in time to the fall of the Soviet Union.
After 6.5 years in power, Mikhail Gorbachev confirmed his resignation on television tonight.
И сейчас от всех и зависит, чтобы она возродилась к новой, современной, отказались от вмешательства в чужие дела и нам ответили доверие. Мы стали одним из главных оплотов по переустройству современной цивилизации на мирных демократических началах.
December 1991. In the dead of winter, 3 men met in a forest on the border of Belarus and Poland. These 3 men were pretty high-ranking: the president of Ukraine, the president of Belarus, and the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. And at the stroke of a pen, these 3 men decided to part ways, to disband the Soviet Union. And in an instance, the Soviet Union was no more, and Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia became their own independent countries. Each of these 3 men had their own reasoning for parting ways, but for the president of Russia, Yeltsin, his reasoning was clear. See, Yeltsin was the president of Russia proper, not the Soviet Union. That honor went to Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union. Russia was the biggest entity within the Soviet Union, but Yeltsin was still number 2 to Gorbachev. That meant if Yeltsin got rid of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev would be no more, and Yeltsin would be number 1. So that's what he did. The Cold War ended, the constant threat of nuclear war was over, and the military alliance of Soviet countries called the Warsaw Pact was no more. And now America was faced with a decision. What do we do with this new country called Russia? Do we still treat them like the enemy? Do we punish them like we did with Germany after World War II? Or do we wipe the slate clean and start anew? Yeltsin wanted the latter. He wanted to make amends with the Americans, so he went to America to offer peace.
Yeltsin came to the United States and he addressed a joint session of Congress. And he said, the people of Russia are offering their hand to the people of the United States in friendship to build a better world, a world without war, a world without peace. And this was exactly what the vast majority of Russians wanted. And I would even say that today, the vast majority of Russians would like to have, if not a friendship with the United States, at least a partnership. There's no doubt to my mind that that's the case.
So the US could have approached Russia one of 2 ways.
The United States could have picked 2 ways of treating Russia. One was to say, let's treat Russia like we did our enemies after World War II. Germany, Italy, and then some of the countries that were occupied, such as France, or were not occupied, such as UK, but were really badly hurt. Let's find a way to see to it that in those countries, Nazis, fascists do not come back and communists do not come to power. And may I remind you that in those days, the Communist Party of France and the Communist Party of Italy were very, very powerful. And that plan turned out was called later the Marshall Plan, which was basically a financial idea to spend a lot of money, but in a very precise way, to develop certain things and not to allow others to develop. Now, that could be the policy to adopt vis-a-vis Russia. See to it that democracy begins to develop in that country. And let me say, just for the record, Russia never, in its entire 1,000 years, never had democracy. Completely absent. So it wasn't like something that once upon a time Russians had and then they lost, but they knew what it was. They didn't know what it was. So let's spend money on getting democracy moving in Russia and seeing to it that the communists do not get back. And that could have been one approach. The other approach was to say, for 40 years, you held a nuclear bomb over our heads, you lost the Cold War, and you're going to pay for it. You're going to be punished for what you did. And there were people who supported one view and people who supported the other in this country.
Can you guess which route America decided to take? Instead of trying to make things work, America decided it would never let another country challenge it ever again. American supremacy was the only goal.
Basically, that view was the one that was accepted. It was the one that would accept it. And the attitude towards Russia was pretty much, you're no longer a superpower. You are a second-rate country. Just keep quiet, please.
And this decision, this attitude change, this fork in the road was what would eventually lead to the crisis in Ukraine today. As punishment for Ukraine, the banks that you trust for your own money have frozen the accounts of people even suspected of being tied to Russia. Even Swiss banks that banked for Germans in World War II froze Russian assets. The message is clear. Your fiat is not safe from governments whatsoever. That is the problem crypto solves. And one great crypto startup is Tune.fm. Tune.fm is the Web3 of Spotify that's actually live and working. It already has artists like Beyonce on there, and basically when the music gets played, the artist gets paid immediately for every second of streaming. And it's much more than what an artist can earn on Spotify, like upwards of 10x more. The reason this is possible is because it's run on their native Jam token, which is based on something called Hedera Hashgraph, an enterprise-level distributed ledger technology owned by Google, IBM, Boeing, and much more. This tech is already working for these giant companies, and it actually allows for fast and cheap microtransactions, unlike fiat or Bitcoin or any other coin project you see out there that's based on an Ethereum ERC protocol. This allows artists to get paid right away, and it even allows for you, the listener, to get paid just by listening to music on Tune.fm. That means if you help discover new music or you help curate music on Tune.fm, you get paid. If this sounds at all interesting to you, Tune.fm is giving you guys 100 Jam coins for free to give it a listen right now when you go to Tune.fm with the link below and sign up. You have nothing to lose by giving it a try, and you'll also be helping improve the music industry. So go to Tune.fm with the link below to claim your free 100 Jam coins right now. Thanks to Tune.fm for sponsoring this video. Back when the Berlin Wall was still standing, the Soviet leader Gorbachev and the US came to an agreement to tear down the Berlin Wall and reunify Germany, but on one sole condition. NATO was not to move an inch eastward towards Russia. This was a big deal and a big promise. You see, NATO is a military alliance by Western powers to keep Europe safe from the threat of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And America basically runs NATO because the US is the biggest and strongest player in it. NATO's entire existence is based around Russia being the sole enemy. NATO expanding into Eastern Europe would be the equivalent of China getting countries like Canada or Mexico to join a military alliance with them. It directly threatens America. So that's why Russia's sole condition was that NATO not expand, especially with post-Soviet countries like Ukraine, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. And for the next 10 years, NATO and the US kept their promise. NATO stayed put, and Russia kept its nose out of their business. But then, President Bill Clinton entered his second term, and things started getting ugly. Somewhere along the line, the US started thinking, who is Russia to tell us what we can or can't do? We won the war. And it didn't help that at the same moment, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were desperately trying to join NATO. You see, NATO wasn't just for protecting Europe against the Soviets anymore. Being a member also gave you access to more trade, sharing of resources, and foreign aid for its less fortunate members, something Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary wanted to get in on. And that got the US thinking, why not just let them join NATO? Russia is unpredictable. Sure, they're playing nice now, but what happens when we disagree with them in the future? It would be nice to have a few bases and troops close enough to make a difference if it comes to it. So in the late 90s, a promise was broken, the only promise Russia cared about, and Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were admitted into NATO.
He called him up and he asked him, what did he think about this decision to enlarge NATO? Let me quote. This is May 2nd, 1998. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War, said Mr. Kennan. Yeltsin was very angry. He made a speech. He said, and of course this is very Yeltsin-like, he said, we're not Haiti. You can't treat us like Haiti. We're a great country. We have a great past, and Russia will come back. Russia will come back. He was really, really angry.
12 days later, NATO forces started bombing Yugoslavia, a country that wasn't part of the Soviet Union, but was always under heavy Soviet influence. Yugoslavia is in Russia's backyard. NATO didn't have UN permission, and they didn't give Russia any warning. They just decided to do it because they were NATO.
From when Gorbachev came to power, March 1985, to 2007, when Putin has been in power for 7 years. That's 22 years. I ask you to find a single thing in foreign or domestic policies done by the Soviet Union while it still existed, and then Russia proper, that might in any way anger, irk, disappoint the United States. Let me answer that for you. Nothing. Not one thing during that period. Now, what did Russia get as a result of that? First, the enlargement of NATO. So that was number one. Then the bombing of Yugoslavia. That was done by NATO, and NATO is, after all, dependent mostly on the United States, let's face it, right? The UN did not condone this. So the bombing of Yugoslavia, that's from March 24th, 99 to June 10th, 99. Then Kosovo and recognition of Kosovo, although it had been part of Serbia for centuries. And there were people in Russia who said, you're letting the gin out of the bottle, because if you do this, then there are other countries that will do the same. And Russia did the same.
This was the turning points. Russia had tried playing by the rules, but it was clear that the Americans didn't take them seriously and that the West couldn't be trusted. Just 1 year after the Yugoslavia bombings, Vladimir Putin became president, and a new era of Russian foreign policy dawns.
Ukrainian children, Ukrainian elderly people, Ukrainian ladies who were killed directly by Putin. And this is, you, Mr. Putin, is a killer, is a maniac.
The West likes to point the finger at Putin for being the aggressor, the madman, Adolf Hitler reincarnated. But the thing is, before the mid-2000s, there was no evidence Putin ever really hated the US. Back when he was still deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, he was even known for helping US businesses settle contract disputes with Russians. He was fascinated with the ex-Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and there's no record of any of the anti-American stuff he's saying now, although he was in the KGB. And back in the early 2000s, Putin did everything he could to give America the benefit of the doubts. As soon as Putin was elected, he asked to join NATO.
The year 2000, Mr. Putin is not elected, although elected, to the presidency. And one of the first things he does is to ask for Russia to become a member of NATO. Why not be a member of NATO? NATO was created to defend Europe, and perhaps not only Europe, from Soviet aggression, from a country that you couldn't predict. There is no more Soviet Union, and there is no more Warsaw Pact. Why can't we create an organization where we're part of it, said Mr. Putin, and act together to protect some kind of aggression? He was told, go take a walk, basically. What about some kind of partnership or becoming part of the European Union? And he said, no, you're too big. Your country's too big. You can't.
Then when 9/11 happened, he offered his country's expertise on Afghanistan to help fight the war on terror.
As soon as 9/11 happens, calls up Bush Jr., W, and offers his help. And yes, and does help in Afghanistan. And if you want to have your soldiers, your military people in Central Asia, right on our borders, be my guest. And in Georgia, absolutely. So it's not just words. We want to fight terrorism together.
Every attempt Russia and Putin made to work with the US was met with scoff. The US broke its promises, and Putin had had enough.
And all the while, Russia was being reminded that it's no longer really that important a country. Now, one of the things you must keep in mind is that much like the Americans, the Russians believe that they have a mission, that their country was selected by destiny. So the sense of losing this aura of greatness, of being told, we don't care about you. The reaction of the average Russian to that was one of, you're insulting me. You don't respect me. In 2007, in Munich, speaking to the group of 20 in Munich, Putin says this. This is February 10th. I think it is obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurance of our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are those declarations today? No one even remembers them. But I will allow myself to remind this audience what was said. I would like to quote the speech of General Secretary Mr. Werner of Brussels on May 17, 1990. He said at the time, quote, "The fact that we are not ready to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee." Where are these guarantees? And do you know what the answer was? The answer was, yes, but that was guarantees given to the Soviet Union. And you're Russia. Well, what kind of a reaction would you expect? Last year, I think it was. Making a foreign policy speech, Putin said, "Our mistake was that we trusted you too much. And your mistake was that you tried to take advantage of that."
The West did not take Russia's warning seriously. Just a year after Putin made his warning abundantly clear, America and NATO takes it a step further.
NATO's Bucharest summit, a declaration is issued which says NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO, that these countries will become members of NATO. So Putin himself said Georgia and Ukraine becoming part of NATO is a direct threat to Russia.
And almost immediately, Putin invades Georgia, using pretty much the exact same playbook he's using today in Ukraine. Russia recognized two pro-Russian separatist provinces in Georgia, just like it did in Ukraine, and used that as an excuse to move troops in, and then launched a full-scale invasion of Georgia, marking the first European war of the 21st century.
You all remember that there was a war between Russia and Georgia in August 2008. That war was a consequence of this, because the Georgians thought we were sending them a signal that they could get uppity with the Russians and we would back them because they were going to become part of NATO. That's not what happened. And you know what happened? The Russians clobbered the Georgians, and Georgia is in deep trouble today because it thought it could become part of NATO.
The only difference between Ukraine and Georgia is that there was hardly any public outcry compared to today. And if you follow the money, there's a very specific reason for that, which we may go over in the future video very soon, so make sure you subscribe. Luckily for Ukraine, they had a pro-Russian president at the time, and joining NATO wasn't a big possibility. But just 5 years later, that was all about to change. Back in November 2013, the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, was weighing his options for the country's future. He could accept a deal from the EU and leave Russia in the dust, or he could take Vladimir Putin's deal for a $15 billion loan and keep their relationship going.
It all starts in November of 2013. At that point, Yanukovych, President Yanukovych, who's the head of Ukraine, is negotiating with the EU to form an association agreement that brings the EU and Ukraine much closer together. It's a step in the direction of incorporating Ukraine into the European Union, or to put it in slightly different terms, incorporating Ukraine into the West. The Russians make it clear that this is unacceptable. Russians are willing to do a deal that involves the EU, Russia, the IMF, and Ukraine. But the idea that Ukraine is going to do a deal exclusively with the EU and the Russians are going to be left out in the cold is not something that Putin is willing to countenance. He puts significant pressure on the Ukrainians. He offers them a terrific deal. And as you can imagine, the EU is not offering Ukraine a particularly good deal because you know how much corruption there is in Ukraine. And the EU wants Ukraine to eliminate that corruption, which the Ukrainians really don't want to do. So what Putin does is not only make it clear that that deal is not going to happen, but he offers a sweetheart deal of his own. So Yanukovych on November 21st says no to the EU.
Yanukovych canceled the EU deal, and suddenly, Ukraine erupts into pro-Western protests. The Ukrainian government reacts harshly to the protests, and a month into it, we had the first 2 deaths in the protests.
Have been continuing in the Ukraine. 2 protesters have reportedly been killed in the unrest in Kiev.
In the February 18th through February 20th time period, lots of people died. It's really messy. And what happens is that a number of European foreign ministers, the German foreign minister, French foreign minister, they fly to Kiev, and a deal is worked out to have elections that will, in effect, remove Yanukovych from power. But the protesters refuse to accept the deal. And there are significant fascist elements among the protesters who are armed, right? There's killing on the Maidan. And as a result, Yanukovych flees for his life to Russia. And this all happens on February 22nd.
In other words, a coup just took place in Russia's crown jewel, the equivalent of a pro-China coup taking place in New York. And to the Russians, the instigators of this coup was clear. It was the West. And the thing is, knowing America's track record of creating, funding, and instigating coups, they're probably right.
In Ukraine, the conversation was deferred. They had this basically pro-Russian, democratically elected president, Yanukovych, who was deposed in a coup in 2014, a coup that was supported by our State Department and probably the CIA, okay?
Immediately, Russia invades the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea.
Putin seized Crimea. Not a year later, not months later, days later. The reason why he was able to seize it so quickly is the Russians actually have a naval base there at Sevastopol. Okay, the area is leased from Ukraine, but they have a naval base there. It allows them to control the Black Sea. So the Russian thinking on this, if you believe it, goes that, listen, we're about to have a pro-Western ruler come into Ukraine, installed by an American-backed coup, and now we're going to lose our main naval base in the Black Sea, and it could be replaced with a NATO base. There's no way that's happening. So they moved to seize Crimea. And then after that, they started backing Russian separatists in the Donbass, and the civil war began. Okay, so that basically is what's been leading up to this.
After the invasion of Crimea in 2014, things stayed tense. After a military buildup on the border of Ukraine, Russia releases its final warning in writing to America and NATO, which included banning Ukraine from entering NATO.
And we could talk about whether there's a pretext in a second, but from the Russian perspective, they said that, listen, and Putin gave a speech like this, if Ukraine joins NATO, because of Article 5, the next time we have a border dispute, which is all the time, right? We could end up getting drawn into a World War III with you guys. And so there is no way we're going to allow Ukraine to be part of NATO. And so they basically by December had given an ultimatum to the State Department.
What was our response to that? Well, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken came out and basically told Russia to go do something to itself that it can't anatomically do.
From our perspective, I can't be more clear. NATO's door is open, remains open, and that is our commitment.
The West once again did not take Russia's threats seriously, and a month later, Putin declares war on Ukraine.
мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
Is it right? No. But when everyone is religiously painting one man as evil, there's usually another side to the story that you're not hearing.
I do think there's something different when it goes from a large majority having one way to it being almost unanimous, where and because things are never unanimous. When people are unanimously on one side, that tells you not that they've all figured out the truth, but that they're in a sort of totalitarian place, that they're in a one-party state where they're not allowed to have dissenting views.
I've actually been to Ukraine just a few months ago, back in August, Kiev specifically, so when I saw them invade, it was like very heartbreaking because I've interacted with these people and most of them are just trying to get by. But again, I wanted to tell the other side of the story because you're not really hearing that anywhere right now. And I've talked to a lot of Russian people that think Putin is completely insane. So more Russian videos are coming, going over other stuff people aren't talking about right now. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. And you can also donate to Ukraine with the button below. But yeah, that's gonna wrap it up. Stay dangerous out there and I will see you guys in the next one.